Welcome to Precinct 444, the podcast where we explore the stories, challenges, and innovation shaping law enforcement today. I'm your host, Josh Bronson. In this episode, we're diving into a topic that impacts officers, agencies, and communities alike: trauma. Joining me is Katie O'Malley, a licensed clinical social worker with extensive experience supporting people impacted by trauma and training law enforcement about understanding the impacts of trauma on victims of crime as well as themselves. We'll talk about how trauma manifests in policing, the concept of collective and generational trauma, and what healing can look like for individuals and departments. This is a conversation about awareness, resilience, and hope. Katie, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much for having me here. What a privilege.
Let's start. I think it would be helpful if we sort of start with a definition of trauma. I think that word trauma is thrown around quite a bit today, and I think sometimes it helps just to start laying the groundwork for the rest of the conversation. So what is trauma?
Yeah, perfect. Great place to start. Agreed. So trauma, there's so many ways that I define this as a therapist, but my most simple definition, I think, is trauma is a normal response to an abnormal event. That definition feels very validating, depathologizing, takes the blame off of the person experiencing the trauma. It also, it's a lot different than stress. I want to note that a lot of people kind of use those terms interchangeably. Stress is more of a normal part of life. That is, the stress is a normal body response to something that is overwhelming or a perceived just big event that there's a lot of emotions behind. There's an implication, though, that stress reduces or subsides once the event concludes. Trauma, on the other hand, is very different. It does not conclude when the event concludes. In fact, that's when the symptoms typically start. So I just like to define stress, if we personified those two. Stress says, that was hard, whereas trauma says, this is unsafe. So already in those two definitions, notice there's a past tense implication with stress of that was hard, it's over though. Whereas trauma says this is continuing to be unsafe, and it will continue to feel that way until it's truly addressed and resolved.
So that's really interesting. I'm glad you explained the difference between those two, because I feel like you're right. Like people do tend to group all those things together because a lot of times they just don't understand the differences. And I think it's important, especially in policing and law enforcement, to understand that there is a difference between those two. Because I can think back to my own career, and, there are times when things are hard, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's traumatic. But there are also times when you are exposed to those incidents that you do have abnormal responses in a way that is not what you think might happen, or you're not prepared for that type of a response. And I think it's interesting to sort of unpack that a little bit in why that is.
Yeah, definitely. Right. Yeah, I think the central theme exactly in what you're saying is trauma revolves around safety, or the lack thereof. And one of the things that I say a lot, both to clients and in my presentations, and I'm sure we'll cover this more, is at the core, trauma involves the lack of two things. And those two things are a lack of power and a lack of control, right? So when your autonomy or sense of choice is taken away or robbed from you, especially when it's taken from you, that's when you start feeling those traumatic symptoms, which is more of a response to that as opposed to stress, not really involving much safety or unsafe components.
Well, it's interesting, too, when we talk about those things like power and control, because, those are two things as prior law enforcement. We like to have power and control over a situation. And I don't say that in a negative way. It's part of the role of law enforcement is have control of a situation, and take control of a situation to minimize harm and all of these things. So when that control is taken away, I don't think we often think of it in the terms of something as seemingly minor. It's not, but seemingly minor as just having that control stripped away from us could be a traumatic incident for us.
Yes, exactly. Right. And I don't want to jump too far ahead, but I can imagine also just understanding the layers of how the lack of control or the surplus of control is so normalized, and what it feels like to lose that might be normal for someone, and that's just part of the job. And yeah, just lots of layers that I'm excited to dive into.
Well, tell me more about that, Katie.
Great. Of course. Absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, just thinking if trauma at its core is the lack of power and control, I just think of how law enforcement operates within the community, and how maybe these community members might also have a relationship with power and control, especially with law enforcement. Gosh, there's so many layers there. But I think when we talk about like trauma-informed policing, that really sits at the intersection of acknowledging the layers of control that police have and also lack, as well as the folks in which they serve, right? The actual communities that they're working with, what their relationship to power and control looks like. So yeah, just seeing how people typically respond. I think there's more in the conversation of generational trauma, which
definitely. That's a really fascinating topic to me. I'm excited to dive into generational and collective trauma a little bit more.
Great.
But yeah, going back to some of the just sort of basic topics within the trauma conversation, when you do have repeated exposure to a traumatic event, how does that impact you? Because I can think back to some of the situations that I was in throughout my career where even something like directing traffic, right?
Yeah.
I really like to think of this as that sort of a seemingly routine, minor sort of incident that everybody who's a police officer has directed traffic someday in their life.
Sure.
And to most people, if you almost get hit by a car, it's recognized as like, well, you almost died potentially, and it's traumatic, right? Whereas in policing, like, you're routinely exposed to situations like that are just part of the job, but we're still human. So where does all that sort of land?
Wow, absolutely. Great question. Yeah, so as a trauma therapist, I feel inclined just to mention there is no one-size-fits-all trauma response. A lot of people respond to trauma without any noticeable, quote-unquote, symptoms or signs on the outside. However, a lot of it is internalized. But yeah, I really like the point you mentioned of we are still humans, but also almost expected to be in a traumatic environment every day as a career, and how taxing that can be. Yeah. So in terms of manifestations of trauma, typically the universal experience at the initial onset, or the experience of trauma, like second one after the trauma occurs or during the trauma even, there's usually a universal activation of the sympathetic nervous system. People know this as the fight or flight response. I want to add the other two, the freeze response and the fawn response. Fawn being please and appease. That's typical for childhood trauma survivors that are have had really extensive trauma. Freeze response is actually the most common for people that I work with, which is more sexual trauma. So any one of those responses are all totally normal. It's not a conscious choice, but I just wanted to name that that's usually the response that occurs in the nervous system. And what that yields behind is tons of endorphins in your body, like this kind of desire to fight or flee or even freeze. You don't usually feel or sense the desire to freeze. It's not exactly a desire, but almost like you're ready to run, right? If you like right before like a track race starts or something, like that kind of feeling. Now, if those endorphins do not have the space to be discharged, for example, this directing traffic idea, like if you are in the middle of your workday and you experience a trauma, you have these endorphins flowing through you, and the next second you're expected to continue on with your work and you don't have a safe place to discharge that energy is bound up and undiscovered, which down the line results in PTSD symptomology. Things like flashbacks or nightmares or what I call shoulder earrings. There's hypervigilance, feeling really on edge, and sometimes not even knowing why. This is all kind of a subconscious feeling that you feel. So people manifest the pent up endorphins in so many different ways, which are culturally contextual and and so forth. But that's usually the universal felt sense, just this endorphin rush. What happens next is really any symptom under the sun can be the manifestation, which is tough because there's no one size fits all.
Yeah. Well, and, I'm reminded too of, when it comes to like repeated sort of traumatization, it's when you're a police officer, sometimes it's completely quiet and you go through your entire shift and, there's no call, right? And especially if you're in a smaller department and rural, place in the U.S. or something along those lines. But there are also agencies or just those shifts that no matter where you are, you can have where you're running from call to call to call and it just won't let up, right? And it's just one call after the other. And sometimes they're really bad calls,
Sure.
from car crashes to homicides to sexual assaults to, and you're just expected to go from call to call to call. And you don't have that opportunity to sort of discharge those feelings and thoughts. Is that sort of what you're...
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, exactly. Right. It does beg the question of how do we address that? Is there any space for this? Is there safety, or is that seen as being weak to pause and like do jumping jacks on the side? Like that would be an example of releasing those endorphins, but it doesn't have to certainly be that dramatic. But even just being aware of it, I think first of all, because it's so normalized and you're expected to continue on, sometimes people don't know what happened, and that can just really lead to this culture of silence and almost unintended secrecy. They're not really seeking out help or support because they don't even know that there's a concern or traumas has happened. But yeah.
Yeah. And to that point, I mean, that's a great point about, the sort of secrecy, keeping it in and not wanting to share your emotions and things like that. I mean, that's something I think as a society, I think we don't do a great job of, necessarily talking about our emotions all the time or, being vulnerable, and especially as men, I think there's, I think there's something to that. And certainly not all police officers are men, of course.
Sure,
but
right.
that sort of culture is, part of policing to that culture of silence. And there are a lot of reasons for that too, right? Where it's even sort of sometimes in your mind as a police officer, sort of practical things like if I tell somebody I'm having suicidal thoughts, I'm going to have my gun taken away and I'm going to be suspended or something like that. I mean,
absolutely. Oh gosh, the fear is very real. Yeah. Oh yeah. We could go on and on about why there are very real fears, not just about workplace performance, but also maybe like peer support might be revoked, or you'll be seen as weak, or even just seeking mental health support. Will my therapist understand? Like, this is my day-to-day life. Even just like the terminology might be unfamiliar, and there's a lot of explaining and that feeling unwelcoming. Yeah, tons of dynamics going on. Something else that rang a bell when you were mentioning this cumulative trauma, or the experiencing it multiple times, like going from call to call to call. I just wanted to name, when I mentioned the fight, flight, freeze, and fawn response. When you go through one of those four responses, which is not a chosen path, but let's say you go through the freeze response once and you show up on a call and maybe there's let's say fight. Let's just say you're going through the fight response, like you're ready to act. Your body is responding in a active way. Each time you go through one of those four F responses, fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, that creates a conditioned hormonal response for the subsequent exposure to trauma to go through that same pathway. So one time that you go through the fight response or whatever it might be, you are much more likely to go through that same response again and again and again. Think about that from the freeze response. Again, this is just what I think about with a lot of the people that I work with, survivors of sexual assault, or really anybody. But going through the freeze response, that leads to so much victim blaming and internalized blaming of, gosh, I can't believe I just was immobilized. Next time this happens, God forbid, I will act. And knowing that this is all on your subconscious, you're not really responding in a conscious way, that really creates a culture of internalized blame. And it comes with this pressure that it's your fault. It's, you should have acted, all of these beliefs that are not true, but that creates yet another symptom. So sometimes that shows up in officers as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if if you have the freeze response, let's say, I mean, there are, we've all heard of officers that, freeze on the scene. I mean, we hear about it in the military from time to time too, right? Where it's like you're faced with this threat and you freeze, and you feel really badly about it because now I'm not carrying out my duty, or there's a lot of shame that goes with that too, compared to a sexual assault survivor in that way, or feeling that I should have done something differently, right?
That's right.
And then going to report it to somebody, telling your supervisor about it and say like, hey, I'm sorry, I just froze, I don't know what happened.
Yes.
And if they're not understanding of that,
beautiful,
then you're gonna hear about it, right? Like you're going to be told you did something wrong.
Of course.
And so that reinforces it, right?
Excellent. Yeah. Excellent as in that's exactly right. Not an excellent thing to happen, but yes. Yeah. I really like here, I like to distinguish even just the difference for anyone listening that this might be helpful for. Guilt versus shame. Brene Brown describes this. Guilt says, I made a mistake. Shame says, I am a mistake. See the difference in personifying that. So if you walk around thinking, I am a mistake, even just in your career, when this is your livelihood, coming forward and sharing something that in their eyes reveals that they are a mistake, there is a lot of incentive to keeping that close to the chest and not coming forward, which is why I think peer support is really crucial with this, rather than more of that superior expectation that they'll come to them for a vulnerable exchange. Peer support has been proven to have a little bit more space for vulnerability. But yeah.
Well, and even I think that goes against some of what, people tend to think, right? I don't even want to talk to my peer about it, my fellow officer, because they're going to judge me and make fun of me, or, whatever the case might be. I think I can think back to situations similar to that where, in my career where it's like, I don't feel like this is worth bringing up, right? Because I don't want to be the butt of jokes or, whatever the case might be, right?
Absolutely.
Even if it wasn't something super serious. But, I think most people in law enforcement can relate to that in some regard, where it's like, so how do you then break through those barriers and create peer support and, have a truly trauma-informed agency almost, where it's not just about how you respond, but, really instituting the practice of being trauma-informed, throughout your agency. And I think that's a really, important question that we all sort of ask ourselves is, how do you truly create a trauma-informed agency where everybody is sort of on board with the conversation around trauma and what to do if somebody sort of reports?
Great question. Thank you. Yeah. So I don't have the gold standard answer because I don't think that exists yet, but I have the next best thing, which is a lot of the work that I do with the Commission on Trauma-Informed Care in Maryland. We've been working to provide the rubric of what it means to have a quote unquote trauma-informed agency. Like, what is the template? What does trauma-informed mean? It's such a buzzword. So we have been heavily consulting the SAMHSA Guiding Principles for Trauma-Informed Care. This is pulled from 2014, but it still remains relevant today. There's 6 core principles that I think are relevant to bring up here. And this comes into play in the use of trauma-informed policing as well. Those components they kind of seem obvious, but in implication, they're really unique. So these are things like just having safety instilled at every level of like, what does it mean to have a culture of safety? Is there space for vulnerability to exist? So that's piece number 1, safety. Trust and transparency is number 2. The third one, which I think is the most important in policing, is peer support, and really specifically having like intentional check-ins, maybe during like roll call or like some way to have a regular space where you're talking to a peer, and there's a sense of security where whatever is said is kept confidential, with a few exceptions, of course, barring some safety concerns. There's also the 4th component is collaboration and mutuality, where everyone has an equal stake in the conversation or even maybe policy decisions, or at least a stake, given, whatever feels appropriate. Also, I think this really makes a trauma-informed place really that is empowerment, choice, and voice. This really goes against that, the symptoms of trauma, which is the loss of power and control. This is kind of the antithesis to that, giving someone really strong sense of a sense of choice, a sense of their voice matters and they can be heard. And then the last thing, which is also important, is cultural, historical, and gender issues. So any opportunity for power dynamics to be exposed, things like implicit bias trainings, of course, also cultural competence, but going beyond that, like cultural humility, what does that look like? What are some identities in the places, the communities in which you serve that we can learn about and maybe take firsthand, topics from them. So that would be my suggestion or encouragement for just a start on what it looks like to be more of a trauma-informed agency or department. But I think vulnerability has to be bottom up. The safety and vulnerability should be bottom up rather than a top down approach. Everything grassroots that's the way for trauma-informed work to blossom when it starts at the bottom. Oh. Yeah.
So, sort of expanding on the idea of trauma a little bit more too. I think there are parts of this that, when you talk about being a trauma-informed agency and things like this, it's certainly part of it is inward, right? But part of it's external and outward facing as well. And I think understanding different concepts within trauma, the trauma conversation is really important too. Things like that aren't necessarily brought up quite as much, I feel like. Things like collective trauma and generational trauma. And so I'm wondering, I'd really like to dive into those a little bit with you. Shifting gears a little bit, but not entirely.
Of course.
Because I think understanding those will really help officers in their jobs as well, not just within their own sort of managing their own sort of trauma, but because I think there is a collective trauma that goes along with policing.
That's right.
And if you have family that were police officers and things like that, there could also be a generational trauma. So, but then also with the community too, right? And talking about how we're interacting with the community. So I'll stop and sort of ask you the question. What is, I've thrown those words around a lot now, collective trauma, generational trauma. What do those concepts, actually mean, and what does that mean to you in the work that you do?
Yeah, great. Thank you. Really important question. Yeah. So as humans, we feel collectively. And collective trauma is just that. It is a trauma that we experience as a group, usually from some commonality that we share with one another. And that is the thing that is being utilized or seen as a threat, something like that. Collective trauma is almost a double-edged sword the way that I see it, in that it can be unifying, paradoxically. It can create this trauma bond where people feel closer to one another because they are kind of they see what was seen as a threat in terms of their identity as a unifying factor, if that makes sense. Maybe it's just like in the police, just the fact that they are police officers or they are present on the scene. In the community, of course, any identity quality, just gender, right, race, anything of that nature. However, collective trauma also comes with the other side of the sword, which is it normalizes a sense of trauma, right? And that can create a culture shift of this is not a big deal, just kind of deal with it. This is part of the job. We are always seen in this way. And that doesn't necessarily try to promote healing. And it just almost provides a layer of kind of complacency in a way of like, this is how it's always been, and therefore there's no space to change it. We've kind of dug our heels in because it feels like a trauma. It feels like that power and control has been taken away. Would that almost be then like, well, we've always done it this way, I had to do it myself? Yes.
Is that the sort of mindset? Is that?
Yes, absolutely. Exactly. Right. And there's almost, it provides like a rite of passage idea. There's pride in some of the collective trauma that has been experienced, especially in officer, just line of duty. Maybe there's, exactly, experiences of like line of duty deaths, or just how there's a response to that within the culture, or just just events of mass violence in any capacity. Gosh, we could go on and on of examples of what this means. But yeah, what it creates in the culture, the trickle-down culture is, I've always done it this way. Why should we change? And
interesting.
Yeah.
And, I'm thinking back to some of the things even outside of policing that, could be remnants of that. I mean, things like hazing even, on an athletics team or something where the coach doesn't step in because, I had to go through this. I got hazed. I was beaten or, whatever the case might be. Right. And then they continue to allow it to happen, and that's the result, right?
Absolutely.
People still get hazed.
Absolutely. Exactly. Where's the impetus for change? Yeah. And I think as you mentioned that, I was kind of thinking about how it creates almost an us versus them mentality, like just deepens the divide, which creates a deeper felt sense of trauma, but it also makes healing all the more necessary. Right? Just how do we interrupt that? And that's things like bringing in a little more of that cultural competence training, just expanding, like what could this look like if we didn't have to go through trauma just to get here in the places that we can adjust, right? Can we have a little more support or just like access to safety or vulnerability where you can feel safe to express this? That's not weak, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and that's a hard concept to get across too, right? And I think part of it too that's difficult in policing when it comes to this is, we do have to prepare officers for the fact that they may die in the line of duty, right? That's a very real reality. I mean, I give tours to the Secret Service every week as part of their trainees come through the museum every week, and I give them tours. And with any police officer, it's a real reality that they may die, in the conduct, in carrying out their duties. With Secret Service, it's even more so because it's like you literally are signing up to potentially, having to take a bullet for an elected official or, somebody.
Right, right.
Or their protectee, I should say. And that, I think, that's part of the challenge with addressing things like collective trauma and policing, I think, is because we have to prepare people for that. But I think we could probably do things a little bit better in how we also then talk about, like, it's okay if that is frankly scary, right? It's, and sort of normalizing that part of the conversation too, that it's a human emotion to feel like this is scary. But that doesn't mean that you can't carry out the job either.
That's right. That's really good. Yeah. Scary is different than I'm under threat of trauma. That's really good to distinguish. Yes, exactly. Scared is, I think that's more on that stress side. Of course, very valid fear and very okay. And it's normal to have an outlet to process that. If this were any other space where there's not a whole, decades of normalizing this, it would be very appropriate and almost seen as encouraged to talk about this with someone else, with a peer or family member. But yeah, there's a unique thing in policing where this is almost embedded into the culture, and it's expected that you don't really comment on it or don't have feelings about the fact that you are preparing to potentially face the worst. And just what that does to a human is really, really tough. And how do you break the cycle? Yeah, it's complex.
Yeah. And then take it out to communities where there's this, collective traumatization that can occur. I mean, we saw it around 9/11. 9/11, I think, is a really good example of sort of collective traumatization. In my mind, at least, it really sort of makes sense.
Right.
Where if you lived through 9/11, or it could go back to the Kennedy assassination, or, any of these sort of major events in the U.S., Pearl Harbor going back further, right? Where, there was this real sense of loss of control, to sort of put it back in the terms that you used before.
Sure.
And loss of power, and this feeling that things were being stripped away from you, your safety was being stripped away from you. And I'm sure there are people, but most people that experience those types of events in the U.S. history or going, anywhere in the world for that matter, but in U.S. history, you can sort of understand that there was this collective traumatization that occurred where I wasn't at the World Trade Center. I
Right.
wasn't at the Pentagon. I wasn't at, the field in Shanksville. I wasn't even on a plane, right? Or anything like that. I was asleep, in fact, because
Isn't that
I'd
interesting?
come off of midnight shift.
Of course.
But there was still this sense of traumatization. Like, I can process back and think back to those times. And even
Definitely.
I remember being in the DC area on an anniversary of 9/11, where hearing a plane fly over on 9/11, sort of on an anniversary of 9/11, sparked this like freeze response. I just stopped me in my
Wow.
tracks, right?
Absolutely.
And I wasn't there for any of that. So is that,
Wow. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. Absolutely. Wow. What a great example and tragic example, of course. With 9/11, my first thought, I just want to mention, most of us were watching that, those of us who were around at that point, most of us were watching that on, TV or radio or some media, right? We weren't physically experiencing it. We don't have to in order to experience trauma. I will say, just my therapist brain is going off of PTSD. The diagnosis was widened in October 2017 to include secondary victimization, which means witnessing a traumatic event. Not to say that everyone who saw that broadcast is under trauma, but I will just note one thing there of the repeated exposure and consistent replays of 9/11. That is, I think about the younger kids who lack object permanence, and they continue to experience that as if it was new each time. That really just does a lot of damage to people. So that's one thing. Just media consumption and media literacy in general. Take care of yourselves. It's okay to take a break, right? Just had to say that. But yes, great point. I really like what you said about, and I'm sorry to hear that happened, but it's very common, right? Just to have some sort of sensory trigger. I'm really glad you mentioned this. Trauma lives in the right side of the brain. That's the sensory side, just to kind of make this simplified. The 5 senses are mediated on that side, which what you're mentioning, Josh, is more of that auditory. That would be an auditory trigger in my eyes, right? So sound, smell, taste, any of those 5. What the components of a traumatic memory that are encoded are almost always sensory in nature, as opposed to left side, which is more logical, rational thought. Like I went down the hallway and then turned left, and just kind of remembering things in a more logical way. That typically doesn't happen as much. Not to say it's invalid if that is the memory for a trauma, but typically it's more sensory. Research has also shown that out of those 5 senses within a trauma experience, smell is the strongest connection to memory out of the 5, right? It's mediated by the olfactory neuron, which is one of the cranial nerves. And it's really neat. You can have, it's neat from a scientific perspective, but someone can, in the same way that you described, someone can just be walking, going about their day, and maybe they literally inhale a scent randomly, just it's in the air. And that can, if that's associated with a past trauma, it can activate those symptoms of arousal or just feeling like, I feel unsafe, even though on the other side of the brain, left brain says, rationally, I know I'm safe. But the clash begins when the sensory says, I am unsafe. And that can lead to the discord between those 2 hemispheres of the brain can lead to conclusions like, I'm crazy, I'm broken, I'm damaged. And that's, again, what really makes this so elusive and insidious with trauma of how do you seek help when you think that you are just crazy for that disconnect, but it's really just trauma speaking. So I'm really grateful for that example.
Well, and it's funny you bring up the sense of smell too, because I can think back to just right after being pepper sprayed in training and everything initially, and going through that experience, I mean, is obviously terrible. It sucks, but
Sure.
But what was really fascinating is that the pepper spray we used, the OC spray that we used, had an orangey sort of smell to it. Right?
Wow. Yeah.
It was like the citrusy, orangey, not real orange, but like the citrusy fake cleaning supply smell almost, right?
Got it. Yes.
So one day, not long after, I'm sitting in a car wash, getting my car washed.
Wow.
And all of a sudden, so the soap starts coming onto the car, right?
Oh my goodness.
And it's that real orangey, citrusy smelling soap, right?
Wow.
And I don't have panic attacks or anything like that. I don't, I've never experienced that necessarily, but that's probably the closest I've come because you're in this enclosed environment.
Goodness.
And rationally, I knew that they weren't, spraying the car down with pepper spray, right? With OC. But I definitely had this, like, I could feel my, quickening of my breathing and, all that sort of stuff where it was just, I was just getting my car washed.
Oh my goodness. Right. Exactly. Thank you for that example. Yeah. And think of how many people go through day-to-day life experiencing these kinds of moments and maybe don't have the language to place this into a trauma category and just think, oh, this is like, I hear this all the time. People just come in and say, like, I am crazy. I'm having a panic attack in the car wash. Someone who's not trauma informed would maybe make that conclusion as if that's their problem, as if they're responding incorrectly. But remember from the very beginning of today, if you've been paying attention, right, trauma is a normal response to an abnormal event. Nothing abnormal about your response. It's the event itself. That's the problem. Put it where it needs to be, the blame.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny too, because at the time I was definitely not trauma informed.
Sure,
so
sure, absolutely.
It's only since, I've learned more about trauma and, how it works in the brain and all of these things that you're talking about. And a lot of it I've learned from you, to be honest, over the years, that I was able to put it into context and be like, oh yeah, that's why that happened. Right?
Wow.
Like, that's why I freaked out in the car wash that day.
Of course. It's totally okay. Yeah. Yeah. And just really being kind to yourself and trying to inject a sense of safety. I can talk more about that if like what to do if you're experiencing a panic attack in the car wash.
Let's do it. Yeah. What do you do? What are some tips that you have for people that, especially if you're a police officer that, you've just had a really difficult experience and, whatever that looks like. I mean, maybe it's a car crash, maybe a child has died. Maybe it's something, again, like almost getting run over by a car while you're out directing traffic or on a traffic stop. Maybe it's you were you were doing a building check because there was an open door or alarm was going off and you're just walking around a building, making sure there's nobody inside.
Sure.
But what are some tips and things that you have for that?
Sure. Okay, great. Okay, I'll have to summarize because this is literally my whole career. So the answer to this question, but yeah, so I'd say kind of a series of things. I'll give a few examples based on where you are in your readiness to, like, if you have the space and safety to kind of go inward. But my first thing, my clients always get tired of me saying these two words, but just notice, period. That's it. Just notice if, like, what's going on internally, if you're carrying anything. That's a really hard step sometimes. When you're on, especially in the field of policing, you don't have the luxury of checking in with yourself or doing all these fluffy things that feel like they're just not appropriate. That would be my first thing. Like, we have to know what it is that we're trying to work through. So if you can, maybe just try to notice, like, where you're maybe carrying tension. Sometimes just like offering a little release to the shoulders. If you can pick a body area where you can just focus on release just a little bit. Sometimes like clenching hands or jaw that holds a lot of stress, usually just try to offer a little bit of space. It doesn't even have to be noticeable by other people. So that would be nice if you can release a little bit. And then I think for folks that are, like you said earlier, just going from call to call to call, and each one is equally traumatic. For that, I would say maybe try to do a little bit of containment. And a lot of this, I would say, try to do this alongside the work of a therapist, of course, but this is my like DIY therapy. So containment, my favorite strategy is whatever the trauma was, whatever just happened, if we can try to see what your emotions are or the memory itself, try to put it, this is strange at first, but bear with me, but try to put it in a shape and a color. What that does is we're getting more towards that sensory right brain side. So we're kind of working with the same part of the brain that creates trauma itself. So let's say we almost stepped into traffic. Wow, that was so scary. So now we put this in, like, I was scared. That's the emotion. You felt it in your shoulders. Okay. Now try to put it in a shape and a color. Random first thing that comes to your mind. Oftentimes trauma is usually like red or black, just interestingly enough, but I don't want to give spoilers. Just go with whatever your inner insight says. So maybe red square. And then this is the containment part. Try to put that red square in at least two boxes or layers. This is all imaginative. It's in your head. And really flesh out the material of the box. Like, okay, put this red square in a cardboard box, seal it up with tape or something, and then put that box in yet another box. That's just to get a little bit of space from it until you can hopefully have a time to process and open the box later when you're maybe off duty. So we're not just creating a tool to bury and put things away forever. That's with the intention of just getting a little bit of space from it just to continue on with your day. I know this is extremely fast-paced work, so that would be my first thing. And then, like we said, trauma it revolves around the lack of power and control, and specifically safety. So that's one of the first things I do with clients is try to create a sensory safe place. Usually the question is, and sorry if this is heavy therapy stuff, I'm trying to be brief, but if you could go to a place, whether it's real or imagined, that felt completely safe, or if that word is not accessible, calm, what would that be? And fleshing out all 5 senses. Like, what would you smell there? What especially smell? I think for officers, like a field of, I don't know, fresh, like pine cones or something, just picking out something that's really vivid. And I know, silly again, but if you could have a smell, because that's the strongest connection to memory, and you could carry that with you like a little roller ball of an essential oil and just like put it under your nose just to inhale that sense of safety, that can really, there's a lot of research that is 14 times stronger than just saying, I am safe, right? That doesn't land because that's a logical thought, but your body has to feel it. So if you can have a sensory safe place that you can brand as safe prior to going into work that day, or going into some sort of traumatic experience. And as soon as you experience the trauma, you just tell your body, I am safe, rather than just telling your mind. That would be a big thing. But I have to cut myself. I have so many more tools, but yeah, there's
I think it's interesting too, because again, most of the time that I was in policing, I was not necessarily super trauma informed, right?
Sure.
It's only since I left that I've become more trauma informed and understood it more. And I think one of the things that that I can think back to that happened to me in regards to some of the tools, and techniques that you just said, even was hitting a deer with my car. And, that's something that I think a lot of people can relate to, whether you're in law enforcement or not.
Of course.
It can be scary, right? Or
Definitely.
even just jarring, right? Even if it's not necessarily scary, especially if you're going a high rate of speed, which I was.
Sure. Oh, gosh.
And
yes.
So when the car came to a stop, it was basically all the lights were on, and, I have OnStar talking to me and, all this sort of stuff.
Wow.
And I remember sitting there and just saying like, okay, I need to take a pause for a minute and like stretch a little bit.
Wow.
And so like I took some breaths and I stretched a little bit, just real like,
That's right.
minor movements in my seat.
Great.
And I feel like that really helped, like sort of put me back into that moment and figure out what to do next and, what needed to happen.
That's so great.
And I think that I don't think we think about those sort of small little, just takes a few seconds even.
Completely. A few seconds.
Doing that can really make a big difference, I feel like.
You're so right. And yeah, think about going back to this endorphin release. Like if trauma always mediates an endorphin release, what you did is allow that an exit ramp to exit, which was really wise of you. A great job. A+ on the trauma response. But yeah. And I guess just for another thing, without going into really deep therapy things, just a quick, immediate thing to do as well for officers. I know like breathing exercises are so overrated sometimes, like it gets to be old, but I will say, if you can, just take this into consideration for anyone listening, maybe just try a quick breath. And I just want to give some awareness on the exhale, specifically the exhale. Inhales stimulate the sympathetic nervous system, which is fight, flight, freeze, fawn. The exhale does the reverse. It activates the parasympathetic nervous system, which is rest and digest. That's where you're actually getting the nervous system back online and calming down. So if you just have a really insane traumatic experience, of course, there's a lot more to do beyond breathing. But if you can, try to elongate the exhale. Maybe 3 deep breaths, and each time make the exhale a little bit longer. That would be my suggestion as well. in addition to the moving, just like a quick shoulder circle or any sort of movement, wringing out your arms or wrists, any movement is great.
I noticed myself taking a deep breath while you were talking about that.
Wow.
I promise I'm not being traumatized right now.
No. Okay. Thank you for the disclaimer. Yes, of course. That's okay. That's awesome.
No, that's all. I think this is so fascinating because I think sometimes we instinctively know, what can calm us down, breathing, for example.
Yes.
I mean, there's, like you said, right. It's sort of almost become cliche to some extent now, right? Just breathe through it or, breathe or.
Of course. Almost demeaning sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. But there's really something to it, I feel like. And I feel like the more we sort of talk about it and normalize it and put it into everyday context, if you're cut off when you're driving or, something like that, or you're, somebody goes to reach for the last good banana in the store, right?
Sure.
And you get that.
Right.
Or
totally.
the old Cabbage Patch Kid wars of the 1980s.
Oh my goodness. Right. Sure. Yeah.
During Christmas time. But,
gosh, right.
I think if we all just sort of take a moment, just to like process what's happening without just reacting. And I know that too sounds counterintuitive to some of law enforcement, right? Because some of it is reacting, right?
That's right.
You have to react, but you also have to make decisions. You also have to be processing thousands of decisions all at once.
That's right.
In law enforcement to make a good decision.
That's right.
But sometimes just that simple breath, right? And like that simple taking a beat, I think is so important.
Crucial. Right. Exactly. Especially when we talk about cumulative trauma and the field is nonstop exposure to trauma, that your critical thinking is also under the traumatic version of thinking, which is usually more black and white, more dichotomous. There's not a lot of room for the gray. So some of these things like try this containment with the shape and color, that feels like so far out of reach. And I completely acknowledge that. And that's not a problem. That's not your fault, right? So I really like the breadth of options here of maybe just interrupting that cycle ever so slightly with maybe 3 seconds or 1 second immediately after. That's all it takes just to slowly break the cycle a bit. You don't only have to respond, or rather, you don't only have to react. You can respond a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Before we wrap up, I do want to go back to generational trauma, though, because we never really dove into that because we got sidetracked with another great conversation, which is totally fine.
Yes.
But I do want, because I did talk about it earlier, I do want to make sure that we define generational trauma and how it's different than collective trauma and how that can sort of manifest in our activities as police officers too. So what is generational trauma?
Yeah. Ooh, thank you so much. I'm so glad we returned back to this. Yes, generational trauma is a very real thing where a lot of people don't understand how this works, but it's not as much nurture where you're, of course, inheriting the ways that parents talk to themselves. Kids usually inherit that. That's more of the nurture track. What generational trauma implies is more of the nature, actual DNA, like being passed down that is impacted by one person's trauma that's inheritable. So the best way to describe generational trauma, just really briefly, there's something called epigenetics, where essentially that describes the chemical alterations of DNA as a result of prolonged trauma or stress. So it actually can change like DNA methylation patterns of stress, like the release of stress hormones, like the pathway that releases stress hormones. Sometimes that can almost open like a floodgate based on how much, of course, one person has experienced it, but it's now encoded in DNA. And there's been studies on descendants of Holocaust survivors or maternal rodents, like mice studies. They've done a lot of studies on this, and there's actually through multiple generations, we can see and track the DNA change in their stress response when the child hasn't actually experienced any trauma themselves, but they have that background of the genetic markings of I went through stress. So that's what generational trauma is. Of course, so many like other factors impact that, but that's my short answer. And then when you layer that into policing, I know there's been a study on police recruits that list 1 in 4 of them have listed a family member who has been in the police force as well. So just think of how police is kind of just constant exposure to trauma. And then when that's passed down, plus other non-job factors that result in generational trauma, there's so much trauma happening that is just in your DNA sometimes. Not to say that anyone is doomed here. It's very okay. It's just, it begs the question to be aware of that. But yeah, so that's kind of my take on generational trauma.
Well, and when you talk about it in that way, right, especially when it comes to, I mean, there are so many, I mean, like you cited the statistics there, and in most of the I mentioned the Secret Service before, but most of the law enforcement trainee classes that come through the museum on tours, which they're from all over, but in talking to them, there's always at least one or two that, their father was a police officer, their mother was a police officer, their grandfather was a police officer,
Right.
And it's just like, it's this whole family history, it's a family tree of policing, right?
Of course. And there's pride in that, of course.
Great. Absolutely. Yeah. And there should be, and yet also it does impact how you perceive events that are happening, right?
Yes, absolutely.
And then when you factor in the community on top of that, you mentioned like Holocaust survivors, right?
Totally.
I mean, I had family that died in the Holocaust, and it's one of those things that you can sort of, when you come from that sort of a lineage, you can sort of process things like, oh, well, it's not that I'm overreacting to one particular thing that might have happened. It's, there's root cause behind it, right?
That's right. That's right.
And to your point about, it doesn't mean you're doomed or anything. I think it is important that we sort of recognize that, that there are those reactions that we have that have nothing to do with our own lived experience.
Of course.
Right?
Absolutely. Just all the more reason to know yourself and your kind of genealogy and what your family has experienced, because otherwise that the disconnect can happen again, where you're responding to stress in a different way than, say, your peers who have not had the same family lineage, of course. And then on the logic side, you're saying, I'm fine, I'm safe, I shouldn't be responding this way. And that results in, again, like the conclusions of I'm crazy or whatnot. But and you mentioned the community. Just one other note about that, thinking of communities, particularly marginalized communities, who also have longstanding generational trauma, especially the ones kind of at odds with police in some way, just culturally speaking, that can carry such a layer of distrust, or how do we kind of bridge the gap here when everyone is so entrenched in their own traumas and sometimes not even being aware of it because it's just inherited from a family lineage, a felt sense of that. Healing just requires, I think, acknowledgement of both traumas or all of the traumas, while also just giving space for the feelings to be shared and seen.
Well, and to that point, I think it ultimately sort of comes down to walking a mile in somebody else's shoes, right? And, things like that, where, acknowledging our shared humanity, right? Where it's like, there are people that have had certain interactions over the years, and it might be police with police. It might be police with, fast food, or, whatever the case might be, right? Like there are lots of different sort of interactions that people have, over the years that sort of build up, a traumatic response, or not even a traumatic response, but just this, like, they don't know how to communicate with somebody that feels differently than them, right?
Wow,
about something.
Well said. Definitely.
And I feel like that is where this like shared humanity piece comes in, where we need to acknowledge you don't have to agree with everybody, right?
Of course.
And I think that it's healthy not to agree with everybody,
I agree.
about everything.
Yes. Definitely. Yeah.
But I think we need to do a better job, not just we in policing, but we as society.
Right.
We need to do a better job of sort of acknowledging those that we all do at the end of the day. We might have different ideas how to get someplace, but we all want the same things at the end of the day, right?
That's
we want our families to be safe. We want our families to be, thrive, to succeed.
Absolutely.
And I think that if we sort of start there, it sort of can break through some of those traumatic responses that people have had over the years from different ways.
Yeah.
And even if we don't think that they're right, just acknowledging that
Right.
they have them, that they're real, sort of like
Yes.
this idea of, you're basically your own reality becomes your truth, right? Like,
Absolutely.
it doesn't mean you're wrong. It doesn't mean you're right. But it doesn't mean you're wrong either.
Of course. And maybe that's not what it's about. We don't have to be
Yeah.
right or wrong. Is that even the black and white thinking? Maybe there's some gray area of like, I feel like I'm right and this person feels like they're right, but we still can have some shared experience of, of being just kind of like bottom layer of the totem pole of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Just like safety and security, or just access to food and water, like that thing. Like we all want that and need that, and that unites us all, right? Focus on what the similarities are between everyone rather than the differences, or celebrate. Yeah, so much more to say there.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Let me give you an opportunity just as we wrap up. I think this has been a really great conversation. And I think, a very helpful one, to understanding, our own minds as well as, other people's minds. But if there's sort of, one additional takeaway, I know you've shared quite a bit at this point, about, different tips and techniques and things like that. But if there's like one or two takeaways that you want to make sure that you get across to people, if they want more information, or they're interested in therapy, or they're interested in, more about trauma, just learning more because they're interested, right?
Absolutely.
Just if you have one or two takeaways.
Wow. Thank you. Yeah, great. I know. I agree. This has been really wonderful and riveting, but yeah, sure. I think, my biggest point that I would want people to take away is anyone experiencing any of this trauma, or whatever you want to call it, it really, truly, deeply is not your fault. And you do deserve healing on the other side, and it's accessible. You are the expert on your own life, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. There's a lot of hope on the other side. Believe me, this is all that I do. I hear people's, stories and experiences of trauma all day, and it's the deepest, most profound privilege of my life to just watch people heal themselves. That's all that this job is, holding space as a therapist, right? That's what a good trauma therapist does. But yeah, you are deserving of the space to heal. I think if any of this resonates at all and you feel like you want deeper support, I think let me be brief. I have a lot to say on this, but the trifecta of trauma therapy in my eyes, just if you're looking for someone, psychologytoday.com is a great place to start. You can just search for therapist on that. I will say, if any of what I'm saying resonates, I'm very polarized in my approaches and modalities. I practice something called IFS, internal family systems, if that resonates, just like parts work. I think the trifecta of good trauma therapy is three things: IFS, EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, really good for police officers because it's usually a lot shorter in terms of time. It's pretty extreme, but so is living with trauma. Yeah. So, it's a double-edged sword there. And then the third one is something called SE, which is somatic experiencing, body stuff. So those are the three. That's like my triangle in my mind of what a good trauma therapist does: IFS, EMDR, and SE. So if you can find someone in those fields, that would be, I think, ideal, but don't take my word for it. Whatever resonates for you. I think that's my biggest thing. I can just say, of course, there's so much information on trauma. I think a good place to start is just looking at the ACEs study, Adverse Childhood Experiences study. That kind of was the basis in like the 80s for just recognizing what trauma does longitudinally. They did like a 30+ year study on people, like children that had experiences of trauma, and how that kind of resonated with them throughout the lifespan. So that's a good place to start. I will say also, just my website has I do a lot of, education workshops for anybody who's interested, but there's a lot of better places to go as well. Whatever suits you is great. But
yeah, I mean, therapy is it's very personal, right? You have to find the right person and
100%.
Relate to them, and
that's right.
Find somebody that understands, sort of, even if they haven't experienced it themselves, certainly, but just that doesn't make you feel like you did anything wrong, right?
Yes. Oh gosh, of course. Anyone who's even giving a shadow of a belief that you are at fault or to blame,
Yeah.
feel free to ditch that person. That's not what a good trauma therapist
You have
should.
permission to.
Oh gosh, you have permission to do anything, but of course especially that, right? Trauma is about reclaiming power and control. So whatever you feel like you need to do to get back to that place, right? It's reclaiming. You didn't lose anything. We just lost access to it. It's not, you have to find this missing piece of you. It's getting back to it, finding it again. It's always been within you all along.
That's great. Thank you so much, Katie. Thank you for sharing your expertise and insights with us. I think it was a really great conversation. It's such an important topic. Trauma is something we can't ignore. It really affects individuals, departments, communities in such profound ways and personal ways.
Yes.
But as we've discussed today, there are paths to healing and resilience. For those listening, remember, seeking help is a sign of strength, not weakness. Mm-hmm. If you want to learn more or access resources, check out the links in our show notes. And as always, thank you for joining us on Precinct 444. Stay safe, stay well, and we'll see you next time.